Alex reopened the same lecture again. It was the third time this week. Later that day, someone asked a question about politics. Alex answered by quoting the same thinker. The next morning, he searched that thinker's name again. Different question, same framework. At first, it feels like learning. A framework explains one problem, then another, then almost everything. And slowly, something subtle happens. Other explanations stop appearing first, not because they disappeared, because one lens keeps arriving before the others. And eventually, you stop referencing the thinker. You start speaking the framework. It doesn't feel dramatic. It just feels like thinking. Everyone remembers the moment a powerful idea first made the world feel clearer. It might come from a book, a lecture, a theory someone explains with unusual clarity. Something about it feels different. Where things once felt confusing, the explanation suddenly fits. Events that once seemed random start to look organized. Problems that felt messy suddenly have structure. The thinker seems to understand something others missed. And when a new explanation feels that precise, the mind remembers it. So the idea stays. You return to it. At first, this is simply curiosity. You explore the framework. You test it against new situations. You ask whether it still holds up. Sometimes it works. Then it works again. And each time it works, something small happens. Trust grows, not loudly, quietly, because the explanation felt right. And when something feels right enough times, it becomes easier to believe it will keep working. Once a framework proves useful, it becomes convenient. You start asking a simple question. How would that thinker explain this? A political debate appears, a relationship conflict, a workplace problem. Instead of beginning from scratch, the mind reaches for the framework that worked before. It saves time. It provides structure. It turns complex situations into something easier to interpret. That's what frameworks are meant to do. They simplify reality. They offer patterns, and patterns help us make sense of the world. So the framework gets used again and again. Each repetition strengthens the pathway. The framework becomes easier to access, which means it appears faster, and the explanation that appears first often feels like the best explanation, even when other explanations exist. The pattern begins to show up in small places. You quote the same thinker during conversations. You recommend the same book to friends. You notice ideas from that framework appearing in your explanations. When something confusing happens, you search for that thinker's interpretation. It becomes a reference point, a reliable tool, and tools that work tend to stay. Then something interesting begins to happen. The tool becomes familiar, so familiar that it stops feeling like a tool. It begins to feel natural, not external, internal. You no longer feel like you are using the framework. You feel like you are thinking. And that difference is subtle, but important, because once the framework feels internal, it becomes harder to see it as something separate from your own reasoning. Something unusual starts happening once a framework proves useful often enough. It begins to explain more than the original problem. At first, the framework might apply to a single topic, maybe politics, maybe economics, maybe relationships. But gradually the same pattern begins to appear everywhere. A conversation about leadership suddenly reminds you of the same theory. A news story seems to fit the same explanation. A social conflict feels predictable through the same lens. It starts to feel as if the thinker anticipated everything. And that feeling is powerful, because when one idea explains multiple situations, it creates the sense that the framework is deeper than the others, more fundamental, more accurate. But there is another reason it feels that way. The framework is simply being applied more often. The more frequently a model is used, the more opportunities it has to appear correct. And every time it appears correct, the mind reinforces the connection, not consciously, automatically. Human thinking relies heavily on patterns. The brain is designed to recognize useful explanations. When a framework successfully explains something, the brain registers that explanation as valuable, and valuable explanations get repeated. Repeated explanations become habits, and habits eventually become shortcuts. This process is efficient. It allows the mind to navigate complex situations quickly, without constantly starting from zero. But efficiency comes with a cost. Each time the same framework explains a problem, alternative interpretations appear less often. Not because they are wrong, but because the familiar explanation arrived first. The mind prefers the explanation it recognizes. Recognition creates confidence. Confidence reinforces repetition, and repetition stabilizes the framework. Over time, the framework begins to shape how problems are seen. New situations are interpreted through the same conceptual lens. Questions begin to change. Instead of asking, "What explanations exist?" the mind begins asking, "How does this framework explain it?" That change seems small, but it alters the structure of thinking. Interpretation becomes guided. The framework organizes the possibilities. Some interpretations feel natural because they fit the framework. Others feel less convincing because they don't. Eventually, the framework begins filtering what gets noticed. Ideas that align with it stand out. Ideas that don't become harder to see. It feels like clarity, but clarity can sometimes be structure. A subtle shift happens in the way questions are asked. In the beginning, frameworks help answer questions. Later, frameworks begin shaping the questions themselves. Instead of wondering, "What might be happening here?" the mind begins asking, "What does this theory say about this?" That small difference changes the direction of thinking, because the moment a question is framed inside a particular system, many answers are already excluded. Not deliberately, just structurally. The framework provides order, but it also provides boundaries. And over time, those boundaries become difficult to see because they feel like the natural limits of the problem, not the limits of the framework. Eventually, the thinker disappears from the sentence. Instead of saying, "According to this philosopher," you say, "I think." The ideas feel internal now. They feel like your conclusions, your reasoning, your perspective. But the structure of the thought was learned somewhere else. This is identity drift. A framework repeated often enough becomes part of the language of thought, not because the person consciously decided to adopt it forever, but because repetition stabilized it. And once stabilized, it feels natural. Ideas that once belonged to someone else now feel like part of your own understanding. One reason this transition goes unnoticed is because it feels like improvement. The world appears easier to understand. Events seem less random. Patterns appear everywhere. And when patterns appear consistently, the mind interprets that as progress. It feels like deeper insight, like learning. And in many ways it is. Frameworks are useful precisely because they help organize complex information. But the same mechanism that creates clarity can also create dependence. Because the more familiar a framework becomes, the less likely the mind is to question it, and the less often it is questioned, the more stable it becomes. Eventually, it stops feeling like one explanation among many. It begins to feel like the explanation. This is why intellectual frameworks are so powerful. They rarely impose themselves dramatically. They integrate quietly. A useful idea becomes a trusted explanation. A trusted explanation becomes a habit. A habit becomes a lens, and the lens eventually becomes invisible. You don't notice the framework anymore. You simply see the world through it. It feels like independent thinking. but the architecture of interpretation has already been inherited. Alex closed the lecture. The explanation made sense. It always did. Later, someone asked another question, and Alex answered the way he usually did, through the same framework, because it worked. And that's the strange thing about powerful ideas. They don't take control suddenly. They simply keep working until the lens disappears and all that remains is thinking.